Let's talk about Donald Trump's slogan. I don't just mean like things that he says a lot, like, lock her up or stable genius or Melania, wake up, I'm not done. I mean like formal slogans, campaign stuff. And he's got Make America Great Again, and that's fine. But the one that you're seeing a lot during his re-election effort is actually promises made, promises kept. It's all over the place. Take a look at his social media activity. Promises made, promises kept. And then promises made and promises kept in September. And then promises made and promises kept when he's doing a speech. It's all over the place. But the problem with that is he's made a lot of promises and he hasn't kept them. And we're not talking about all of them. That's not an analysis. We'll do that at some point. But like, he promised that he'd fix healthcare. In fact, he promised he'd do single payer healthcare, everyone, universal coverage, and he hasn't. He promised he'd enact term limits for Congress. He hasn't even tried to do that. He promised that trade wars are easy to win, discovered they're not. He promised he'd bring back steel and coal, and it's actually doing way worse under him than it was before. He promised that the wall on the border would be built, and it hasn't been, and he especially promised that Mexico would pay for it, and of course it hasn't, and it won't. But as important as those promises that he broke are, there's one that I think is more empirical and more obvious. And if the Republican Party, if the conservative movement, if the Tea Party was serious about the things it says it believes, this would be the cardinal sin. And that has to do with the national deficit and the debt. And it's very clear what he had said he would do on these two areas. In February of 2016, the future president appeared on Fox News and assured viewers that if he were president, he could start paying off the national debt so easily. A month after that, in April 2016, Trump declared that he was confident that he could get rid of the entire multi-trillion-dollar debt, quote, fairly quickly. Pressed to be more specific, the future president replied, well, I would say over a period of 8 years. By July 2016, he was boasting that once his economic agenda was in place, quote, we'll start paying off that debt like water. I don't know what that means either, so don't feel bad that that doesn't seem to be an actual expression. It's not, just like he died like a dog. It's not an expression, he just thinks it is because he's a weirdo. But anyway, it was very clear there. National deficit is gonna be gone, national debt, we're gonna pay it off. So we're like 3 years into his presidency now, basically. How is he doing so far? So let's take a look at this promise made and see if it's also a promise kept. Well, the US government's budget deficit ballooned to nearly $1 trillion in 2019, according to the Treasury Department just a few days ago, as the United States fiscal imbalance widened for a fourth consecutive year, despite a sustained run of economic growth. So that's amazing. The deficit grew $205 billion, or 16% in just the last year. The deficit is up nearly 50% in the Trump era. And considering when you actually mark the starting point for that, some say that he's increased it by 68%. So he's moving fast on it, but not necessarily in the right direction, actually. And so let's take a look at how this has worked out year by year. Interesting chart here showing the numbers for that deficit. And you can see you got a little bit of Bush at the beginning. It jumps up during the Great Recession, and then gradually Obama pays down the deficit, gets it lower and lower, and Trump comes in and boom, 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 it's jumping up year by year. Actually, oddly like it did under George W. Bush. And the weird thing is, they're the party that says that they're fiscally responsible, not like those tax and spend liberals. They are responsible when it comes to the budget, they'll take control of it. That's why you should vote them into office. And yet it always seems to explode when they're in power. It always seems like a Democrat comes into office with huge deficits and then they have to be the responsible ones and then they pay it down, like in the 90s, like under Obama. And then they get voted out just in time for trillions more dollars to be given in tax cuts to the wealthiest people in the history of our species. And then what do you know, it jumps up again. In fact, just as a quick side note, I was doing some analysis of the tax bill that Donald Trump passed, and that's responsible for 20% of the increase in the deficit. So he could have been a lot closer to accomplishing his promise if he had just not made good on his promise behind closed doors to the wealthiest people in America that he would give them untold riches. So that's the deficit, blowing up under Donald Trump, despite all of his assurances that that wouldn't happen. What about the debt? Okay, that's something that Republicans have been talking about for decades. It is unsustainable. It is a national security threat to America that our debt is as high as it is, and especially so much of it foreign debt. Well, the US is $3 trillion more in debt than it was when Mr. Trump entered the White House. In those 3 years, it rose 15% from $19.9 trillion to $22.9 trillion. And that really should not be surprising, because when the deficit is going up, that's what makes the debt. I mean, if you got $1 trillion deficit, I have a prediction for how much higher the debt is gonna be in a year. I think it's gonna be like $1 trillion higher, actually. We'll see, maybe he'll exceed that. But anyway, he has made this big promise and he wants to run on keeping his promises. And this is one of the biggest ones that he has not kept. And you might recall the Tea Party, who came into office saying immediately as soon as Obama was sworn in, Tea Party rallies were all over the place. And it totally wasn't because he was black. It was totally just because of fiscal responsibility concerns. And they thought that they needed to make a big public show of how important the deficit is, how important the debt is. They elected congressmen and senators all over the place just on that. And yet, where have they been? Where have they been as they've been voting in favor of all of these priorities of Donald Trump that have exploded the deficit and increased the debt over and over and over again? It doesn't look good for them. It doesn't look like they were actually serious about those things. It certainly doesn't look like Donald Trump was serious time after time during the 2016 election when he promised that he would not do what he has now done. But here's the thing, Donald Trump still has one more year definitely as president, unless he's removed, which probably isn't gonna happen. He might even have 5 years. So while this is not a promise kept yet, there is still time. And I'm not saying I have a plan to get rid of the deficit, that I have a plan to get rid of the debt. Donald Trump has a plan. Not a plan that he revealed in 2016, but if you go back to 1999, Trump once proposed clearing the nation's debt at the expense of the rich. You can see a New York Times headline here. This was when he was doing exploratory committee to run for president at that time. Because another lie was that he's never tried to run for president before. He totally has. But anyway, he said he had a proposal that the government should impose a one-time 14.25% tax on the net worth of individuals and trusts worth $10 million or more. That would raise $5.7 trillion, enough to pay off the national debt in a single year. So, we're talking now about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, their wealth taxes. Donald Trump had a wealth tax way back in 1999. And the way he saw it, the rich can afford to pay a little bit one time to clear off this debt that we all seem to agree is such a threat to the future of America. Now look, the national debt is higher than it was back in 1999, which means that tax might have to be a little bit higher. But after all, Donald, it is your idea. And after all, you promised to get rid of this. The solution has been handed to you by past Donald Trump. The only question is whether or not you will actually make good on all those promises from your campaign. For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.